Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful program for you today regarding the pandemic, plunging oil prices, and Mr. Putin. I'd like to introduce to you Maria Logan, who's a trustee of the Future of the Russia Foundation. This session we have today is the first of a series that we are doing with the Future of the Russia Foundation to highlight key issues in Russia and for Western policy towards Russia. Maria, welcome. Unmute, Maria.
I'm still not accustomed to this this new technology, but thank you, Ambassador, and welcome everyone, and big welcome from London. So the Future of Russia Foundation is a UK charity, and we're very happy to be a partner to the Atlantic Council and help support this programs. This is the first one, so we're very excited and look forward to the other events as well. Ambassador asked me to be very brief, so I don't want to waste anyone's time, and let's move to the discussion.
Perfect. Anders.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. My name is Anders Åslund. I'm a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Good morning, everybody in Europe, and afternoon in Europe, and good morning, everybody in the US. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you a really star-studded panel of 4 people who knew as much as you possibly would like to know about the Russian economy. And these 4 people are first Vladimir Milov, former Deputy Minister of Energy in Russia and a long time one of the opposition leaders in Russia, now the leading economist in Alexey Navalny's team, and he does a wonderful television program, Where is the Money, in Russian once a week. And our second speaker is Sergei Guriev, a long-time president of a new economic school in Moscow, which was absolutely outstanding when he led it. He was later chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and now he's a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Our third speaker is Elina Ribakova, formerly with Deutsche Bank in London, and now deputy chief economist of the Institute of International Finance in Washington. And our fourth, but not least, speaker is Sergei Alexashenko, formerly Deputy Minister of Finance of Russia and first Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank, and then held senior positions in the private sector in Russia. And now he's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution here in Washington. So what we should discuss today is, where is the Russian economy? For a long time, Russia has been stuck in near stagnation with almost no economic growth. To say that the expectation was 1% growth this year, and Putin was not happy with it, but wanted to have more economic growth through more investment. But instead, what he got was first the coronavirus crisis, which was he disregarded for a long time. And then, quite amazingly, in early March, Russia started an oil price war with Saudi Arabia. So the question today to all of the participants is, where are we now, and what is going to happen? What is the policy likely to be, and what would you suggest should be done? But let me ask with the question to Vladimir Milov. You are in Moscow now. What does the situation look like in Moscow? How bad is it? Are there any protests? And what measures would you suggest in this situation? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody, and it's a privilege to be a regular at the Atlantic Council events and to speak to such a distinguished panel today. First, just really tragic news which just came out 2 hours ago. We had a record number of coronavirus deaths yesterday, 232. Which is, I mean, if it's going to hit 300 in the coming couple of days, it means it will be doubling in just 1 week. So we had a total number of cases going slightly down from above 10,000 a day and new cases to like 8,500, which is still a lot. And the bad news is that corona deaths are going up. Plus, also, after the public pressure and the international pressure, Moscow city government has reconsidered the April death statistics from the virus upwards. They included all the what they call doubtful cases. They mark them as corona. I regard it as a result of pressure by international media. They were forced to move statistics closer to the reality. So it might seem that the pandemic in Russia is sort of receding, but I would say we just entering the phase of big problems because authorities are betting big on reopening of the economy. For instance, if you listen to the major government officials like central bank governor Nabiullin or economic minister Reshetnikov, they really hope for a pretty quick recovery after a couple of months of lockdown. But I think first we're going to come back to the economic discussion. But I think the big threat right here is that the pandemic is in such a severe state that the country is not really ready for reopening. And reopening would actually mean more and more new cases. So we might see a need for further lockdowns, reintroduction of lockdowns down the road in Moscow and in the regions. Another bad news is that corona is spreading well beyond Moscow into the Russian regions, which was not the case just a couple of months ago. Plus, what we see is that there's a huge bottom-up demand from the population to open up because Russia has a unique situation. Government has ordered a pretty strict lockdown, but at the same time, they didn't provide meaningful economic aid to people and businesses to compensate for sitting home and loss of revenue. That is a unique situation. Like people joked about the 90s that we had a shock without therapy. So right now we have a lockdown without any economic aid from the government. So it's sort of a Putin's know-how to still milk the cow while stopping feeding it. So that's the big issue. As a matter of fact, you might hear news from Moscow that Mayor Sobyanin gradually easing the lockdown had allowed some gradual walks for the people 2 kilometers away from the house by schedule, which is published by the Moscow government. But as a matter of fact, all these rules are mostly ignored right now. There's a lot of people on the streets and not much enforcement. So everybody roams as they like, many without masks, because people really are angry about this 2 months sitting at home without major economic assistance from the government. So they say, okay, to hell with it. I mean, I'm going and I can't stand this anymore. So I think government feels this bottom-up pressure, which is why they're rushing with opening up, which is, I think, pretty much premature. And they will have to reintroduce lockdowns if the pandemic will become stronger again and we'll have more new cases. Now, on the protest side, I mean, generally, if we speak about mass population, the priority number one is to stay healthy at the moment. I think after 2 months of extremely unfortunate, confusing messages in February, March, people had finally realized, most of the polls show that majority realizes that the threat is serious. So I would say that people are right now preoccupied with their health, safety, and economic well-being. But you saw the news that Putin's ratings are plunging because of all what is happening and how the government is handling this. Believe me, we'll see protests down the road. This is just not the right time. I mean, the political activity will come back later. Right now, I think people are mostly focused on their health and the economic situation.
Thank you very much. That's very clarifying. Let me ask you one question specifically on the death numbers. There has been lots of discussion that Russia hides And Russia has currently only 1% of the cases, or 0.5% of the cases actually end in death, while in Italy it was 14%. And these numbers vary enormously from country to country, but Russia is one of the true outliers. How much would you guess is because of underreporting of deaths, and how much is simply that the coronavirus is less dangerous for one reason or the other in Russia?
Well, I think it's not just about underreporting, it's about they insist on a classification where they do not count the deaths as corona deaths if people had other pre-existing conditions like heart disease or something, but they were also corona positive. So they insist that not all people who are dead having the corona shall be classified as corona deaths. They say it's our methodology. Now, I think the big difference with Italy is the age of population, because in Italy, you really do have a lot of elderly people who are essentially most exposed to this situation. And in Russia, obviously, you know that life expectancy is much lower, particularly among men. So I think this is one of the explainers why we are behind the death rate than in Italy. But recently, I think, because of the public pressure, I think the authorities have started to somewhat reconsider the death counts. And the Moscow city government, as I said, revised the numbers upwards significantly.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I should tell all the participants that you are most welcome to pose questions. If you have a question to any or all of the participants, please put it in the question and answer box Q&A you see at the bottom of the screen if you are on Zoom. And I will then read out the questions under your name or anonymously as you like it. Sergei Guriev, I would like to ask you more about how you assess the Putin crisis policy as yet. I mean, the three words that it can be summarized in is denial for a long time, late start, and little money, and then ending up with delegation to the regional governors, which looks surprisingly similar to the Donald Trump strategy here in the United States, and the results seem to be pretty similar. How would you explain his policy, and do you see any changes in the government policy coming?
Thank you, Anders. I fully agree with you. The response, at least the economic response to the crisis, was delayed, slow, and indeed insufficient, small scale. And part of that was also related to delegation to the regions. There are several things that can explain it. First, the context of these constitutional amendments that Putin initiated right before the epidemics. His address to the parliament was January 15, and he was still hoping that somehow he will pull off a vote in April for those constitutional amendments that would eventually reset his clock and allow him to run again in 2024 and restart the count of his term limits and stay in power until 2036. So he was engaged in this wishful thinking that would still work. So another part of the context is the main source of legitimacy of the state is whatever you think about that, but it is the victory of Soviet Union in 1945. And so this is a special year, which again for Putin was very important to organize a military parade on May 9th and invite global leaders and overcome some of the self-imposed isolation Russia is in after 2014. And again, he was engaged in wishful thinking that somehow he would be able to pull it off. The parade would take place in May. That didn't happen. That kind of explains the denial and the slow start. Part of the other explanation is just the lack of feedback channels. And this is not a bug of Putin's system, it's a feature. It's an authoritarian system with censorship, without media freedom, without free political opposition and civil society. So Putin does not really know what's going on the ground. and there are no good channels to deliver information to him. Vladimir was talking about distorted information. We think that Putin knows more than Russian official TV reports, but not necessarily everything. So recently, for example, there was a big outbreak in Dagestan, and we saw that Putin would send doctors from Moscow to Dagestan, which suggests that, contrary to what was reported on official media, he at least monitors some independent sources of information. But this response was delayed after this outbreak was actually horrible, costing at least hundreds of lives. So this delayed response suggests his information is imperfect. Now, another part of the problem is Russian government is very rich. So when you look at what Vladimir and Alexey Navalny and their colleagues do, covering the living standards of Russian government officials, you see that these people don't fully understand the economic challenges that Russian public is facing. So if you have a big country house, if you have good internet connection, if you have savings, if you have private doctors, you don't really understand people who have no income, no savings, a lack of access to healthcare, and you don't really understand why these people demand economic support. And that's why Russian government has not responded with packages which would be as generous as their Western counterparts. Right now, we would characterize the total package as something like 3% of GDP, which is, of course, much below Western counterparts spending 10, 20, 30% of GDP. And even within this 3% of GDP, some of this money, actually a substantial part of this money, is just tax credits. So you can pay your taxes later in the year. Very little part of this package is actually giving money directly to the people. And in that sense, this stinginess, this small scale of the response, I guess, is explained by a lack of realization how big the problem is. But there is also another factor that contributes, which is the political economy factor. The businesses and the individuals who mostly suffer from the economic recession related to COVID are the businesses that are not Putin's friends. So we think about service sector, we think about middle class in the private sector, people who work for smaller businesses. So these people are less likely to be supportive of Putin. And his friends are big businesses, state companies, people who work for the state directly. So these people are being supported as simply just by maintaining status quo. People who work for the state keep getting paid, while small businesses and middle class and self-employed and informally employed are the people who can, once again, like that happened in 2011, come to the street and protest against Putin's rule. So it is actually, however horrible it sounds, it is not inconsistent with Putin's political interests to let those businesses go down the drain, because then bigger businesses will replace smaller businesses, and whatever is bad for a small restaurant is good for Putin's chef, Mr. Prigozhin, picking up demand, picking up business opportunities when smaller restaurants are going out of the market. So to sum up, there are a number of reasons which are lack of information, but also political economy, but also this wishful thinking in the beginning that determined Russia's slow, delayed, and small-scale response. Regarding the delegation to the regions, I think this is not as stupid because Russian regions are all different and they face different challenges. However, this delegation hasn't happened with material support. So by telling the regions, it's your problem now, Mr. Putin didn't say, here is the money I can give you to fight the epidemic. And that, of course, reminds us what happened in the recent years with the healthcare system overall. In 2012, Mr. Putin came out with this May decree where he said, I want to pay doctors more. And since doctors are paid by the regions, it's the region's problem. But you have to pay the doctors. And the region said, we don't have the money. So Putin said, you still have to pay doctors more on average. So what the regions did, they fired the doctors and paid remaining doctors a bit more. And so this is what we are seeing now. The implications of this, what's called healthcare optimization, result in devastating blow of the pandemic in some of the regions. But overall, I don't think delegation to the regions is a stupid idea per se. I think, however, this delegation should have been accompanied by material resources given to the regions.
Thank you very much, Sergei. Very interesting. Elina, very nice to see you. Normally, we just socialized on Twitter, and you normally write about the finances of the countries in the region, and in particular about the Russian financial situation. So that's what I wanted to ask you about. But I would also like to add something that you normally don't write about, and that is the impact of Western financial sanctions. And do you think it would have a much impact if they are being changed? That is sometimes discussed, not least in this crisis.
Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be in this fantastic company. I've known all these gentlemen for a long time, and I've been learning from them. And that's almost like a rounding up of the usual suspects, but in a good way. So on the financial side, I want to say that Fortress Russia was a reaction partially to the sanctions of June 2014. And Anders, you recently summarized it very well in your recent note. Fortress Russia is working. So we've been writing about massive outflows from emerging markets, unprecedented, big size. Of course, some of it is beginning to stabilize, but not much of it is returning. Where it is returning is to safe haven Russia, because they have worked extremely well in terms of creating the right incentives for short-term fixed income portfolio investors. So it's a very narrow, specific group that is interested in the local government bonds. It also helps you support through the capital account as well, because it's an inflow, and it's enjoying this fantastic opportunity. There is no debt to GDP to speak of, right? You have external debt, which is lower than total reserves. You have national wealth fund, which is not being spent, even better. You have very modest fiscal stimulus despite the oil price collapse, and you still have, the deficit will widen, but it's not going to be as dramatic as many other countries. You know that Saudi Arabia is cutting aggressively across the board all the expenditure, never mind no fiscal stimulus, right? So for a very narrow group of the fixed income investors, this is all great news. You know, they're not very interested in the healthcare aspect of this, or about the lack of opportunities for the long-term investments, right? This is a very, very specialized group. So I think for that, that's an important point from the global financial industry to be aware of. And in terms of sanctions, if they were loosened up for whatever reason, the highly hypothetical scenario right now, you'd probably see more inflows. And specifically into this category, it's unlikely you would see FDI flows, but you will see this very narrow money coming in and possibly even pushing ruble to appreciate. So the reaction to sanctions, we learned the lesson in a way from the authorities. The fastest way out of the office is the financial instability. And therefore, we're going to approach this Fortress Russia aggressively, and they have managed to turn it around. Of course, the unfortunate sort of victims, the innocent victims of this is, as Sergei and Vladimir were pointing out, is that, for example, fiscal consolidation, that was one of the most aggressive, even compared to the IMF programs cross-country. Part of it was what suffers first, usually, is the regional budgets. So they have regional, allocate responsibilities to the regional budgets, and it is healthcare, it is education, it is social services, but you just don't fund them. And that's the first way of doing your fiscal consolidation. And then, of course, you keep on cutting to the bone. So from the macroeconomic perspective, it looks fantastic because fiscal adjustment was massive, and the reduction in the, from 114 break-even oil price to very low numbers now. It's so almost, it's even on 20 they get some monies in, but I'd say it's probably around $40 per barrel right now, the break-even price. So it's a huge reduction. But of course, the side effects is a lot of social services provision investment is underfunded.
Thank you very much. I think we should clarify to the listeners, $40 per barrel break even, that's for the budget, while Russian oil companies make money even if a price goes down to $15 per barrel. Something that comes out very strongly, both in what you and Sergei Guriev said, that is, Russia has enough of money. and but it's being husbanded, and as both of you said, it's being kept centrally. It's being kept by the important people, and it's not going out to the regions. And as far as I understand, nothing is really happening on sanctions or expected to happen. I agree on that. Let me then pass the floor to Sergei Alexashenko. You are very active in the Russian economic debate. I see you in particular on Moskwy. And my question to you is more, what advice would you like to give to Mr. Putin today? What should he do?
Thank you, Anders. It's a great question. And thanks everybody for joining us for this very interesting conversation. And I believe that it's maybe the greatest panel of Russian experts. And I think that we should put aside any hypothesis that Mr. Putin is ready to change his political agenda. So I do not believe that in any circumstances he is ready to give up power either to democratic voting or to his successor. He decided to grab power for at least for another 15 years. And that's why your question is what Mr. Putin can do, being the president of Russia, being the authoritarian leader, without changing democratic principles of the country, without rebuilding federation. And first of all, we have to emphasize that this crisis, this economic crisis, recession in the whole world is a very specific, and it's a little bit artificial, and it's touching the most services sector. And Russia, due to its developing stage, has not very great service sector. For example, if you take hotels and restaurants, they account more than 7% of GDP in the United States and less than 2% in Russia. The number of airline passengers in Russia, adjusted to the size of the country, to the size of the population, is 3 times less than in the United States. And that's why the overall decline, the overall recession of the Russian economy will definitely be less, and the economic impact on the budget, on the GDP numbers, definitely will be much smaller than in the United States or in the European Union. So Mr. Putin understands very well that his economy is based on oil and other natural resources that the country is exporting. Unfortunately, he can do nothing to push oil price. And that's why my first advice would be keep the agreement with OPEC. So on June 10th, vote to continue the reduction by 10 million barrels and do not insist the increase in oil production, because we see that oil prices started to recover a little bit and the market still is unstable. There is oversupply, and any shift, if the oil production will start to increase faster than the global economic recovery is happening, definitely it will be the blow to the oil market and to the oil price, and that will be the problem for you, for your government. Second issue is that Russian economy, aside of natural resources, is based as well on the national champions. National champions in shipbuilding, in aviation, in military technology, and every sector. And the Russian banking sector is based on the state-controlled banks. So you should keep your eyes and keep your hands on the financial situation of those champions, of those giants, of those jumbo enterprises, and help them to keep at least their liquidity. You cannot solve the problem of their solvency. You cannot solve the problem of their efficiency, but do not let them sink. Give any credits you need, subsidized by the budget, subsidized by the central bank, subsidized by national welfare fund, but still do not allow liquidity crisis emerge within this champions league. So they should not suffer from the liquidity crisis. And the last but not least point, I would say that Mr. Putin did prepare to the banking crisis. It may be not as acute as it was before, but nevertheless, a lot of big banks and a lot of bad loans will emerge in the economy. Maybe they will be concentrated in the sector of real estate, and maybe they will be concentrated in some particular banks. But definitely, if small business, if retail trade, if restaurants will be closed up, there will be a lot of bad loans in the banking sector. Of course, Russian banks, they have a big experience how to hide those loans, bad loans, by restructuring, but be prepared that you will need to inject some additional capital first to the state-controlled bank. Maybe you will stop there and just reduce competition, reduce the influence of private and foreign-owned banks in the Russian banking sector. So that's it if we stay within his political agenda and we do not change political pillars of the country and we do not stop Russian aggression in the Ukraine. So, and we do not try to remove Western sanctions.
Thank you very much, Sergei. And of course, what you emphasize here about the national champions is very important. I notice that both Rosneft and Gazprom are now getting big losses of several $1 billion or a few $1 billion in the first quarter already. And then from your answer, it comes the government will fill it up in one way or the other. But let me turn to oil questions. I've seen here that there are several questions coming in about oil. I'll pass them first to Vladimir, but others might want to come in later on. One question is from Danila Galperovic. What will be the outcome of recent frictions between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US around oil prices for the Russian economy? And another question, is the Russian government expecting a higher recovery of the oil price? If so, how soon and how high? And this is Ed Chow, who asked for Vladimir's personal forecast on the one hand, but on the other hand, what is the government expecting and hoping for? And then a third question is on oil. Is how is the Russia-Saudi feud of the oil price progressing, and how successful has President Trump been in trying to mediate this issue? That is from Raymond Bacca. And I would like to ask a question from myself. What do you think will happen to Russian oil production? How much will it decrease this year as a whole? So, Vladimir, first, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, on the expectations of the Russian government about the oil price recovery, yes, they think that the oil would come back to $40, $50 per barrel in the coming months, probably closer to the fall, largely because of organic wiping off of the most expensive production, mainly US shale, but not only. We know that a lot of producers actually cannot stand such low prices, and they cannot ensure commercial viability of oil output, so they will be closing organically output cut deal or no deal, and this is what the government bets on. I mean, we don't know. I also support that view that organic cuts of productions will be massive, but in terms of resilience of producers, in terms of volumes, we don't know. I'd say it's a logical way of thinking that oil prices will recover some months down the road, but it remains to be seen. What is important, though, and here's where we have a long-standing dispute with Sergei Alexashenko about the OPEC deal. I'm a firm opponent of any quotas artificially imposed on the market. They are pretty bad. So what the previous deal with OPEC, which lasted for 3 years, have done is that it had only delayed a very genuine global oil oversupply crisis and only made it worse. because there was a huge accumulated oversupply which was supported by the previous Russia plus OPEC cuts. They artificially kept price at $60, $70 per barrel for a couple of years, which allowed more production to come on stream, which facilitated the oversupply, which did hit everybody this March and April when we had a collapse of demand. So right now, I think they're pretty much following on the same erroneous pattern. We seen it all before in 1980s, and we all had our 1985 moment when Saudi Arabia said, we can't do this anymore. There is no point in cutting production because we can't do anything with the price. Right now, we're almost 2 months into the new OPEC Russia deal, which was concluded in early April. I have to say that oil price is basically at the same level when it was back then on the 9th of April when it was signed. And also on the future of this deal and on the impact of the Russian economy, I believe that this deal would collapse pretty much the same as previous one did, because I don't see any real evidence from the ground that Russia is massively cutting oil output. They do some cuts, but to a limited extent, and we will know first credible data on June 16th when Rosstat publishes monthly oil output for May, the first month when the deal came into effect. Only before that, we will not know any more or less credible statistics, but I really don't see massive cuts happening. Russia will again be to blame by the Saudis. There will be a new scandal which will threaten the existence of this deal. But look, again, deal or no deal, we have entered a period of objective, genuine, extreme global oversupply of oil, which means that even if the oil prices will recover somehow, there will still be not enough super profits to finance all of the Putin's aggressive government spending policy that was supposed to promote growth, the national projects and so on. There will be simply no money for that except borrowing, which Elina mentioned. I just wanted to make one addition to her remarks that Silvanov, the finance minister, gave a very interesting interview to Vedomosti in early May. I strongly encourage everyone to read. He said the problem with borrowing is that because Russia has a very high borrowing costs as opposed to Western nations. Developed countries borrow at less than 1%, and we have to borrow at 6%. Because of sanctions and because of prohibitive country risk, because of all this tyranny of Siloviki, bureaucracy, and it makes no sense to invest in the current environment, which is why the country risk is producing such high borrowing rates. So no super profits from oil, very high cost of borrowing, means that Putin's economic development model is now clearly in trouble.
Yeah, thank you very much. One specific question on this. Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft and one of the people closest to Putin, and of course Silavik, is very much considered to have instigated this oil price war. Do you think that his position has been weakened because of Russia's effective failure in the oil price war, or is it as strong as ever?
No, I don't think that he was weakened before. Look, this collapse of the OPEC deal was long in the making. There was trouble along the way, like all throughout the previous year, for instance. And I think it's pretty clear that Putin is, no matter what he says in public, he's on Sechin's side, because he buys the argument that we really lose market to Americans by maintaining the OPEC quotas, and he doesn't like that. He likes Sechin better than the Americans, which is why I don't think, there was some PR damage to Sechin because of the collapse of this deal, but I think not in Putin's eyes, really.
Thank you. I have here a question that is clearly for Sergei Guriev from Celeste Wallander. It's about small and medium-sized enterprises. She writes, a number of analysis projects that these will experience disproportionate failures in the coming months, as you said, as a consequence of a recession, lockdown, reduced consumer activity, and lack of government support. support. Is that correct? And what factors do you think will be most damaging to small and medium-sized enterprises? And I may add here, what does it really mean? You started elaborating on it economically and socially to Russia, that they declined so much.
Thank you, Anders, and thank you, Celeste. Indeed, this is the crisis which disproportionately hits small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in certain sectors such as entertainment, catering, hotels, tourism, all kinds of services that are actually hurt directly by lockdown. And since we're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises, most of these firms don't have working capital, have difficulty of attracting cheap loans from the government or from the government-owned banks. And in this sense, some of them may just not reopen simply because they will go down. Now, what the other governments do, they indeed roll out programs of government support where either through direct subsidies or through loan guarantees, they provide those companies with possibility to keep employment and also keep paying rent. So when the lockdown is lifted, these companies don't need to spend time and effort on rehiring personnel and finding new place to reopen in. And so this is why in other countries there is this hope that these businesses will reopen as normal. So France has reopened on May 11, and you already have barbershops, which in France is a very important industry, completely busy. So I booked my haircut for 2 weeks from now. I booked it a few days ago. All the barbershops have reopened. Now, whether in Russia small barbershops will reopen is a good question. Whether small restaurants will reopen is a good question. And as I mentioned, this is a conscious choice of priorities and also probably lack of information about how hard those businesses will be hit. And in principle, Russian government identified several industries, and pretty much 20% of small and medium-sized employment works in those industries. So about 3 million people are working in industries and small and medium-sized businesses, which Russian government wants to help. But what we also have seen is this government support doesn't really work as planned, exactly because Putin doesn't have a working and efficient government hierarchy. And so we have a lot of feedback that money which is supposed to be delivered to small and medium-sized businesses does not reach the potential recipients. And so many of those firms which are eligible for government support will not get government support. So it's a big deal, and I think we will see many small firms not reopening after the lockdown.
I think this is quite an interesting point that you made, and together with Sergei Alexey's point before that hotels and restaurants are only 2% of GDP in Russia compared to 7% in the US. On the one hand, it means that the government sees, okay, our GDP doesn't fall as much as in the West, but on the other hand, people see that their standard of living is all the more hurt, and much more so than
one of the things which I think is important is in the city of Moscow, the quality of life has improved in many ways, exactly because of those service sector companies. That would be healthcare or fitness instructors or restaurants or entertainment, and that will be noticed by many people, that these companies will not reopen, these small firms will not reopen. So some decline in Putin's popularity will be observed in Moscow, where those businesses played an important role for the middle class, both as a source of income, but also as a source of higher quality of life.
Yeah, thank you. Elina, I have a question for you here from Yevgenia. I think it is from Oxford Economics, another our Twitter friend. And she wonders about the fiscal road. Will the government stick to the low fiscal support and which is restrained by the fiscal rule, or will the government suspend the fiscal rule in this situation?
Thank you. That's a very important question. The last time they suspended the fiscal rule, I think it took almost a decade, more than a decade almost, or close to a decade to reinstate it. So I'm on the sort of more hawkish side. I think it's important to keep the fiscal rule, even if you might have some temporary exceptions or deviations, because it's a unique shock. But I think the system at least put some framework around the monetary and fiscal policy in Russia. It's important to have the basic frameworks. And if you just think about what discussions we had in 2014, people were asking, are we going to go into uncontrolled money printing, and are we going to have hyperinflation? And maybe in a way that would lead to a faster change in leadership. But on the other hand, it would definitely not help lower income individuals to have imprudent government policies. So I think that is important to keep, and I'll be watching it closely because it is a sort of a power struggle, and it's important for investors as well where this is moving. And just very quickly to also react to Vladimir's point about the cost of borrowing, I'm less worried about the current cost of borrowing for the fixed income and the country risk just for this specific narrow borrowing. I more want to make a point, the type of inflows that are going to Russia. If this were a fully open, transparent, rule of law and all the other wonderful things and motherhood and apple pie reforms passed, you would see much more FDI, you would see much more equity investment, and this is very different type of investment. So I think it's more the volume and the quality and the type of flows that we're seeing to Russia. And of course, that would also help with diversification of the economy. Right now, it's highly concentrated purely in oil and gas, and with state-controlled enterprises controlling the big chunk of economy and also employment. And I think that's where sort of that's what kills any hope of diversification. And then very quickly on Saudi and Russia relationship, it's all geopolitical, right? And it's important, if Russia had ambitions to be active geopolitically in the region, it needed to have other types of relationship that ties them with the kingdom and not only sort of with other players in the region. So I think it had something to do with fiscal adjustment and the break-even oil price, but it also had with the geopolitical aspirations. And I think that's what the relationship is important for.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got a question from Roman Kornev, pointing out that, as I think that Sergei said, that Russia has run an ultra-austerity since 2014. And I know that you, Sergei Guriev, has argued for substantial stimulus together with some other economists of 6 to 8% of GDP. You mentioned now that the total stimulus is 3% of GDP. I think that you have done so also. Sergei Alexashenko and you, Vladimir Milov, have also argued for substantial stimulus and that it should go to the people rather than to big state enterprises. So who would like to pick up on this topic?
Well, may I add, Anders, may I add a few words? First, on a real government stimulus. Again, extremely informative interview of Silovanov, which is given to Vedomosti, and he was pressed by the journalists. They asked, what is the real actual cash stimulus? Not some deferred tax liabilities, not government guarantees, but actually the money that are being poured into the economy. And he said, he mentioned a few items which altogether make just little more than 1% of GDP, 1.5 at best. And most of this direct cash assistance is also pretty delayed, because first it goes to regional level and it goes to other levels before it actually gets to the economy. So the real stimulus provided by the government is even less than what everybody discussed. I also wanted to clarify an important point, because both Sergeis have mentioned a relatively small role of the service sector in the GDP. That is true. However, it is totally opposite when it comes down to employment. If anybody wants, I can send you, please write me on the social media. I will send you a graph that I made for my Где деньги program on Navalny Live. Wholesale and retail trade plus hotels and restaurants make up about 14 million jobs in Russia, as opposed to well below 2 million for extractive industries. So this is right. When colleagues explain Putin's thinking, he thinks that all these small folks, they don't make a lot in terms of contribution to GDP, so forget about them, we'll focus on the big boys, right? But the big boys make less and less jobs because industries obviously become more and more automated. And it's this small service sector which dominates the job market, which is hurt the most. Actually, it's heartbreaking to read all these personal direct messages that I have on my Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram accounts every day. Like before I joined this video, there were a couple more messages from small businessmen who said, we are shutting down completely. We're not planning to reopen because we're out of money and we don't expect any demand recovery soon. So I think this is one of the factors which a lot of the government and a lot of people focused on the macro picture. This is something they don't really take into account, that the erosion of this ecosystem of smaller and medium-sized services sector business is so damaging right now that the pattern to recovery would be very, very difficult.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important point. Sergei, Alexey, you wanted to come in also on this issue, and I have a question for you specifically from Ambassador William Courtney about the state banks. The state banks are becoming ever more dominant. Will this continue? Or will the private banks be squeezed out, or will we see some privatization of any big state banks? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anders. First, about banks, I believe that nationalization of the banking system is an ongoing process, and it will continue in the years to come. And it is evident that Putin's regime, Putin's government, Putin's central bank, they provided different lucrative opportunities for state-controlled banks. They provide them giant projects, and they play competition rules in favor of the state-controlled banks. And definitely, if the banking crisis occurs, the state banks will immediately receive support from the government, while private banks will go to their shareholders who are lacking money. So I do not anticipate that it will be some significant jump or nationalization of the whole banking industry overnight, but day by day, year by year, state-controlled banks will dominate in the industry, and I do not believe that any of big state-controlled banks will be privatized. Privatized not by 10%, because it's not privatization, but privatized, let's say, by 60%, when the control over the bank will go to the private hands. So that is privatization. If if the government controls 40% in the company, but controls 70% seats in the board of directors, okay, that means that the government still controls. So the real nationalization will go on. On the fiscal stimulus, I would say that it's not such an easy question. I agree with Vladimir that small business is very important in employment, and definitely households will lose, Russian households will lose in this crisis, like in every crisis before. But Russian system is not adjusted to give money to the people. Even in the United States, it's a big problem. For example, today's data of the Bureau on Economic Analysis demonstrated that households' incomes in April increased by 10% due to treasury checks, but the households' expenditures declined by 13%. So that means that extra money came to some people who don't need them. And in Russia, that may be the same problem. If you give money to everybody, that means bulk of people will just spend them to purchase foreign exchange or to purchase some financial assets. And there is no any good idea how to deliver money to the people who is in need, to the lower income. The average, the median income level per capita in Russia today is something like $350 per month, and it's really poverty. And the target for the government, how to find those people. And I think that's Putin recognizes very well that small business, in his mind, as he said openly, are crooks. Everybody are crooks. So you should not give money to them. But as to people, he is rather cynical. saying, okay, people do not request money, why should we give them? Because politically and socially, there's no any visible unrest, and seems people, as usual, and Boris Godunov, people are silent.
Yeah, we are approaching the close of our session now, and I thought that I should pose the question that I forewarned you about at the beginning, and I'll put it in reverse order. How much do you think that the Russian GDP will fall this year? I start with you, Sergei Alexashenko.
I do believe that the fall in GDP will be between 5 and 6%.
Elina?
I have around -6 actually.
Sergei Guriev?
I would actually say 6. Now it looks like crowding, really hurting, but I would say 6. But I can also see how it could be worse. But
Vladimir?
It's going to be definitely worse than 6, probably closer to 10. In worse scenarios, maybe even worse. But I'd say closer to 10 is my estimate.
Yeah, my estimate, as I put in the recent notice, 9%. The idea that what Sergei Alexashenko elaborated, that the closing of the economy will be less of a cost in Russia because the personal service sector is much less. So this is the argument why it should be 5-6% decline only. But I take the central bank estimate from last year that if oil price this year is $25, then it would be -4%. But admittedly now, Vladimir puts the oil price at a slightly higher level. We have not talked about the exchange rate because that's not much of a deal. It's 75 rubles per dollar, and it's floating harmonically around. We haven't talked about the current account deficit, or just touched upon it. Elina did so, because, or what am I saying, deficit, it's a surplus. It's a stable and public debt and so forth. So what comes out of this discussion is very much the macroeconomic looks very good, but it doesn't look good for the people. I should pose a last question to you, Sergei Guriev. I have here from Maria Logan. That is, you discussed about various parts of the population, that the small private sector is dismissed and the state sector is taken care of. And her question is, do the public employees really stick to Putin, or do you see any significant group of public employees who would abandon Putin? That's the last question.
Well, we do see, as Vladimir mentioned in the beginning, that there is a major decline in Putin's approval ratings, to the extent we don't see some of them. Some of them are no longer published. And part of that can be indeed due to decline among public sector employees, including doctors in particular, who have not been treated too well. Also, even if you work for the state, you may have relatives and friends who work in small businesses and services and so on. Also, some people working for the state would also have a secondary source of income, a part-time job here and there, and these jobs may disappear right now. So we don't see many people who will come out and say, I love Putin more coming out of this crisis because Putin has done such an excellent job. He's a great leader. I support him more. We don't see anybody except for people working on state TV. Well, talking about TV, I would like to say that Vladimir's show is great, but it's not a TV show. It's a YouTube show for a very good reason, as you can imagine.
Sorry, I call YouTube shows television shows because it is a real TV show as it is. But indeed, you are, of course, correct. Thank you very much. I think that you have provided us with a lot of interesting substance and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.